and issuing false financial statements, among other claims. Now, Trump and the Trump Organization is now expected to repay more than $354 million. New York Attorney General Letitia James had accused the former president and his organization of overstating his net worth in order to win favorable terms on loans. In September, New York Supreme Court Judge Arthur Engoron found Trump had committed fraud for more than a decade, but had not yet ruled on 6 other claims that we just learned about today. CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa joins me now. Bob, does today's ruling mean, what does it mean, rather, for the former president? We know this is not a criminal case. This really affects his business dealings.
Jerika, good to be with you. This is not a criminal case. It is a civil fraud case. But this penalty is sweeping in scope. Former President Donald Trump and his co-defendants in this case ordered today by Judge Arthur Engoron to pay out more than $300 million, about $350 million in damages, because he believes that the Trump Organization, led by former President Trump for many years, defrauded the state of New York. And not only is there a financial penalty as part of this ruling, a very comprehensive ruling by Engoron, we're also seeing former President Donald Trump being barred from being a director or leader of any corporation in the state of New York for the next 3 years. That's a directive for not only Trump, but other co-defendants in this case, including the former chief financial executive at the Trump Organization, Alan Weisselberg. And Donald Trump's own sons, Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr., are barred from being in an executive or leadership main position at a New York company for the next 2 years. Now, for some people, this kind of ruling maybe wouldn't be that dramatic. But for the Trump family, which is so intertwined with the Trump Organization, going back to Fred Trump, the former president's father, who built all of these developments in the New York City boroughs in the 1960s and 1970s, and then Trump as he developed his own properties in the 80s and 90s. The family is the business. And Trump has so much of his valuation as part of his brand, as part of his marketing value. And now he is going to likely have to find significant amount of cash to pay out this penalty. And as he pays out this penalty, he will, of course, try to appeal it in the coming months, but he will also be under a cash crunch. He's facing the E. Jean Carroll civil penalty of over $80 million. He was found liable of rape in that civil case in New York. And for someone who doesn't have his whole business in cash, this is a real challenge facing him. We don't have direct details on how he's going to pay it out yet and the timeline for how he will be ordered to do so. But what's important to know here is over $300 million now could be coming out of the Trump coffers to the state of New York. And while he pays that out, he can't work as an executive in the state.
All right. That's absolutely right. I'm joined now here with Scott McFarland and Major Garrett. I want to talk to you about Donald Trump's children, because there are moments where the judge mentions them in this as well. You guys are just going through the documents right now. I just got them handed to me here. But as we're learning about more of the details, what more can you say about the children involved in all of this?
The judge is pretty emphatic about this and unequivocal, saying Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump, according to sufficient evidence, intentionally falsified business records, and the penalties extend to them, too. They are also banned now from running a corporation in the state of New York for 2 years. You'll also recall during the trial, they took the stand. So did Ivanka Trump, and those are some of the most powerful moments of the trial. Ivanka Trump there for hours answering questions about what her brothers, her father, and she did with this corporation. It truly was part of the spectacle that was this trial, but in the meat of this judgment is a ban on the sons from running a business and a clear statement from the judge they were intentional in their falsifications.
And Major, I want to turn to you, because you've been covering all parts of everything related to Donald Trump, and not just this case, but the other ones as well. What type of impact does this have on his campaign, especially knowing just recently we learned about the March 25th start of the trial? Well, he will have to be present for several weeks.
Sure. So we have lots of different legal buckets where the former president is involved. You have criminal, you have civil. This is civil, but this is much larger than it's reputational. This strikes at the very heart of Donald Trump's larger American story of being an aggressive deal maker who makes things happen and who builds fortunes for himself and for others. And what this case has always been about is, was there something illegitimate about all those representations within the Trump real estate empire? Were things valued more than they were worth? Were things misrepresented to momentarily provide financial advantage to the Trump family or the Trump organization at some harm either to the state of New York or to creditors or borrowers? And this case is really about, yes, in fact, when you look at the numbers and when you scrutinize everything that was marketed about the Trump brand and the Trump name, it didn't add up. And no case on the docket in the last 2 years has more infuriated the former president than this one.
It was personal, without a doubt. I want to turn now to political campaign reporter Katrina Kaufman. She's been following many of the former president's legal troubles. Are you surprised at all by this? Obviously, Letitia James, the Attorney General in New York, asking for $370 million, but $354 million. And it's probably assumed that Trump will appeal this.
Of course he'll appeal. They've been making that clear since day one of this case, that they knew that they were going to lose and that they thought that they would win this case on appeal. I can't say that I'm surprised by this ruling. It is almost what Letitia James asked for. And I was struck by a part of it where the judge talks about the lack of contrition. He says it borders on almost pathological, and that the only thing that Trump would even admit was a mistake was the size of his triplex, which Trump actually did during the closing arguments when he, in court, started speaking for about 5 minutes, really unauthorized by the judge, and I think accidentally admitted that that was a mistake.
And as far as some of what we're talking about in reference to his other legal woes, how do you think this will impact some of the other, the upcoming trial that I just mentioned starting next month, only because it seems that it hasn't necessarily affected him on the campaign trail. Does this sort of start to change the tide, if you will?
I think it impacts him financially. As Bob was saying, he has huge debts to pay now. He has the E. Jean Carroll trial, that's $83.3 million, plus a previous $5 million. Now this is another $350 million. So it's really hurting him financially. And he hasn't done well in New York. He just lost the E. Jean Carroll trial here. He has not done well in the civil fraud verdict. And now he has the hush money trial coming up. And that is going to be the first criminal trial ever prosecuted against a former president.
CBS News, Rachel, thank you. CBS News legal expert and analyst Ricky Kleeman joins us now. Ricky, how does this compare to the criminal cases facing Trump right now?
Well, people might think that the criminal cases are far more significant against Donald Trump because it involves, of course, the possibility of conviction and ultimately the possibility of prison time. However, I would say that I am one of the legal experts, among many others, who firmly believes that this case, above all cases, is the one that disturbs Donald Trump most of all. You have to remember that Donald Trump has felt that Judge Engoron has been prejudiced against him from the very beginning and has been very vocal about that fact, saying that the fraud was the first ruling, and so why were we even having a trial? Because the only thing left was to decide a penalty. So Donald Trump and his lawyers must have fully expected that the penalty would be mighty. The problem here, Jerika, is this. It's not so much only the brand. It's not the mix of the political and the legal for me. What it says to me is if I am Donald Trump's lawyer, I think I have many grounds for appeal, but I've got to post money or a surety bond in order to go forward with the appeal. And in New York, that is a phenomenal amount of money because it's either the $350 million plus interest that you would have to come up with to go forward with the appeal, or it's a surety bond. And who's going to give him a surety bond when the collateral for the bond might be properties that have to be sold? So he's in a very, very difficult position in terms of not only his finances, but in how he projects himself to the world. I think this is far more significant to him and to his attorneys than going forward at the end of March in New York with a criminal case.
All right. And Ricky, we want you to stand by. I want to turn now to Scott McFarland. I know that you've talked about the threats, and it's discussed here in this document that wasn't just facing the judge, but also those who work around him. How impactful, or what was the message there in this ruling? In the courtroom for this trial, what struck me most was the ugliness of this trial. There was a gag order issued because Donald Trump was posting on social media conspiracy theories about the judge's clerk, and he persisted in doing so. Those led to some number of threats against the court staff or against the judge's office, and it begs the question, Jerika and Major, are we going to see more of that when Donald Trump returns to court in all these criminal cases that are now stacked up from New York to D.C. to Florida to Georgia? The tenor and tone of this trial were troubling to so many people, and it's not his last time in court.
And it's worth pointing out that in that context that Scott just raised, the former president spends an extravagant amount of time talking about a two-tiered system of justice in this country, alleging that he is a victim of one that is harsher on him than it is on other Americans. Any other defendant who acted as former President Trump did in those social media posts would have received far more harsh a penalty than a momentary, temporary, and limited gag order. They would have probably been held in contempt of court. That was never even on the table for the former president. So in this conduct, in this space that he finds himself, where there's permissible room for him to threaten or create the atmosphere of threat around judicial proceedings, he is being encouraged, or at least entitled to something that most other Americans would be denied, and denied almost instantaneously. So you don't think this will have an impact in terms of his decorum or how he reacts or responds? It might or it might not. What we know that the record established so far is he has been given latitude. No other defendant in this country would be. I want to turn to Robert Costa, who's standing by as well there in New York. You were also in the courtroom for some of this. Has Trump been using this civil trial as a campaign opportunity?
It's been quite a scene, Jerika, to cover in New York over the past few months. Former President Donald Trump has not always been called to be in the courtroom. He has decided voluntarily to appear there, and he doesn't just slip in the back door. He goes in, he talks to this cascade of reporters in front of him, cameras, and he holds court almost like he's on the campaign trail. And he makes a mini speech oftentimes before he enters the courtroom. And sometimes he takes breaks during the course of this civil fraud trial to come outside the room and sharply criticize Judge Engoron and some members of Judge Engoron's staff, to the point where there have been multiple confrontations between the judge and Trump in the courtroom about his conduct, warning Trump that he's going over the line. So there was never a question here about whether fraud took place in the eyes of Judge Engoron. This civil fraud case began with the judge stating he believed there was fraud that took place. It was always going to be about the penalty. But instead of trying to appeal to the judge, be friendly to the judge, Trump has launched not only a legal war against him, but a political war against him. And he has cast the judge as an enemy of Trump, not just someone he's fighting inside the courtroom. Okay. Robert, thank you. I want to turn back to Ricky. Now that we know, and as we pointed out earlier, it was likely to happen that he would appeal if this wasn't favorable, which how could it be, knowing what we knew going into this? What is next? What will be the process? How long does this sort of drag out? What can you tell us?
Well, the appeal has teeth. One of the things that we do know is that the Associated Press did a study of over 70 cases where there was the situation of this of a magnitude of fraud, and in no case was there a fraud with this magnitude of punishment, an extraordinary sum of dollars of punishment, where there was no victim and ultimately no damage to the victim, being the banks, according to the banks. It's not a situation where people have lost money, let alone lost lives because of a fraud. So when he goes forward through his lawyers with the appeal, assuming that he can come up with money to post for the appeal, he really does have a viable argument that this is a different justice system applying to him and to his business. And because we do not have someone who's saying, I was hurt. This was an argument raised over and over in court, and it was an argument that the judge had said that he did not accept. because it didn't matter under this New York 70-year-old statute that you had to have damage to a victim. So there will be a very good appeal, at least in terms of argument, on this issue alone. What happens is the appeal has to be docketed. In order, a notice of appeal is filed, it is docketed, but money has to be posted in order for it to go forward. This appeal, some people say it could take a year. Some people say it could take longer. There are other people who will say, no, that the first department of the appellate division, which will be the first appellate court to look at this, has a very complete record and can act expeditiously. I am not quite so optimistic about the question of time. I think these things do take time, and these issues are complicated.
And I wonder how much time, you really have during an election year, and the impact I think that will have on people. And I'm sure, we wait to find out. No one can speculate. But obviously, we've seen sort of this before. We know we've been talking about the various cases that he's involved with, and it seems to sort of, his supporters and whatnot are not taken aback by accusations, allegations, and we don't know what will be the outcome, obviously, with this latest development. I want to turn to Katrina and go back to you in terms of if you believe that Trump is sort of being made an example of. I mean, you heard Ricky just talk about the Associated Press report and having a strong argument for not being treated before like other folks, but obviously not having this kind of money that we're talking about with over $300 million.
Yeah, well, another part of this opinion that stood out to me is Judge Engoron says that New York means business in combating business fraud. And he talks about the harm that false statements inflict on the marketplace. So, maybe he is trying to make an example of Trump here. He wants to show people that they can't conduct this type of fraudulent business practice. And to that end, he also extends, there was a special monitor appointed to oversee the financial dealings of the Trump Organization. And she's going to be kept on for another few years. Before Judge Engoron even released this ruling, she had put out a report, and it showed that she found continued errors in their financial records. So even after this case, or as it was already being tried, this type of fraud was potentially being perpetuated at the organization. Okay.
And I want to turn to Scott McFarland. We talk about sort of the money flowing and surrounding, whether it's Rudy Giuliani or Dominion, some of these other civil cases. What does that mean, and what can we gain from what we know at this point in reference to this case and others that are connected to former President Donald Trump?
It's quite something, isn't it? People are wondering, when's Donald Trump going to stand trial in these criminal cases? And he is successfully throwing sand in the gears and pushing these trial dates back. There was supposed to be a trial March 4th in the election subversion case. That's going to be punted till summer at the earliest. But the money cases are moving, not just the defamation case involving E. Jean Carroll. This massive judgment today. And then there are the related cases involving 2020. Rudy Giuliani loses in order to pay tens of millions of dollars. That massive Fox News Dominion defamation settlement for nearly $750 million. There's no criminal accountability yet for the former president, but you can see the civil cases are moving along pretty swiftly.
And Sharika, to Ricky's point about this case, and is it fundamentally different than other New York cases? Well, as the judge in this very lengthy opinion tries to go to some lengths to explain, it is different in magnitude and duration, and, as Katrina mentioned, this idea of pathology, this repetitive process of deceiving people in your business practices. The judge may argue, and the appellate court will have to decide, is it rare enough and exceptional enough to warrant this kind of procedural remedy? That's what the appeals court is going to decide. The Trump lawyers will say, no, this is only happening because it's a political effort to weaken the former president, and everyone involved with moving this case forward will say, no, your business practices are yours, you're the author of them, and you must be held accountable.
Because, again, we've been at this table, and maybe not myself normally covering something like this special report, but you guys, without a doubt, what do you expect to hear from the former president? Do you think he comes out with a statement or speaks to the public today?
Well, there's no question about that. And let's not ignore, Tarika, the racial component of this. The former president has said Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, is a racist and is doing this for race-based reasons. He has played that aggressively. There's no evidence of that whatsoever, but that is part of his angry, volatile political response to this. Quite separate from what your documents say, what do the numbers add up to, what are the appraisals, what are the valuations? No. He wants to put this in as toxically charged a political context as possible. That has been part of his past. It may be part of his most immediate future.
He stepped out of that courtroom each time he could before the media called the Attorney General a racist, called the case a witch hunt, and said that he should be paid damages for what he's suffering and what his family's going through. It has seemed to galvanize some level of political support for him, so I expect him to continue with that drumbeat.
Because it's not over and we know there will be an appeal process, is this a win for Letitia James?
It is a successful response to a case she brought. I'm not in the business of describing wins and losses for prosecutors or attorney generals. She had to know. Anyone who brings a case against the former president knows, and this is certainly playing out in Fulton County, if you take on the former president, you are taking on a phalanx of attorneys and supporters and scrutinizers. Everything will be scrutinized to the nth degree. Letitia James knew that. There's a remedy today that's now favorable to what she brought before the judge.
And Ricky, same question to you. I mean, again, you've been there, you've been in courtrooms, you're very familiar, obviously, with Letitia James, how this case was played out. You know, she wanted a permanent barring for Donald Trump. It was 3 years based on this ruling. Is this not only just, obviously, Major pointed out, successful, but in your opinion, in your eyes, is this good for her?
This is a huge win for Letitia James. You have to remember she is the one who, in fact, absolutely got this started, that she is the person who, as I said on the day that this was filed, she dared, absolutely dared, the district attorney in New York, Alvin Bragg, to go forward with a prosecution, which he had declined to do. And so she wins. Anybody who says, well, she didn't get it all, she got so much of it all, she is definitely going to be someone who can celebrate tonight. At the same time, you have to remember that there are lawyers involved in all of these cases and that there are different lawyers involved in each case. This appeal is going to go forward with vigor. At the same time, there's a different group of lawyers that is going to go try the Alvin Bragg, New York City, New York County criminal case involving falsification of business records. At the same time, there is a different group of lawyers that is going to go looking forward at the January 6th case and on through the others. He does not, Donald Trump is not stopped by this verdict. If anything, he's going to be energized by this judgment, not a verdict, by this judgment from this judge, which Donald Trump and his lawyers fully anticipated would be bad, and it is. And he has an argument as to why he is the exception to the rule, and that's just what he would like to have.
All right, Ricky, thank you for that. As you heard, we're going to go to Robert Costa. You heard Ricky say this didn't stop him, but energized him. We've now given you a little bit of time to look through that document, and you've been able to pull out some key points here. If you could share with us what you've learned.
Tarika, we're learning new details about what exactly is in this ruling. The defendant, the main one here, former President Donald Trump, being ordered by the judge to pay the plaintiff, the state of New York, $354 million. So you think in just recent months, he now has over $400 million. If you add the E. Jean Carroll $80 million plus to this, you're looking at over $400 million he's now facing against his core finances. But he has to pay $354 million. Eric Trump, his son, liable in the amount of $4 million, approximately $4 million for Eric Trump. Not chump change. Donald Trump Jr., his other son, along with Barron, who's not included in this at all, his youngest son, but his oldest son, Donald Trump Jr., liable for $4 million, approximately. And then Alan Weisselberg, who's been at the center of all the Trump finances and those different court cases that have been circulating Trump Organization for a long time, he's liable to the state of New York for $1 million exactly. So you're looking at about $364 million total in penalties for the defendants across the board. $354 million of that $364 million approximately for former President Donald Trump.
Yeah, definitely a large amount of money. Scott McFarland, you're just getting a statement from the Trump Organization?
Yeah, and it echoes a lot of what Donald Trump had been saying outside the courthouse each day. He calls this a miscarriage of justice. And he makes this argument that he made regularly during the trial that if this stands, businesses will leave New York. Great businesses will exit the state. The statement includes this excerpt, Tarika. Every member of the New York business community, no matter the industry, should be gravely concerned with this gross overreach and brazen attempt by the Attorney General to exert limitless power where no private or public harm has been established. If allowed to stand, this ruling will only further expedite the continuing exodus of companies from New York. That is the rhythm he was trying to make a drumbeat outside court when he held forth during the trial.
Tarika, there's also something worth noting on page 36 of this ruling, and it talks about a disagreement over the value of Mar-a-Lago, a property that the former president justifiably takes enormous pride in. Let me quote from this directly. Nonetheless, Donald Trump insisted that he believed Mar-a-Lago is worth between $1 billion and $1.5 billion, which would require not only valuing it as a private residence, which the deed prohibits, I'm still quoting here, but as more than the most expensive private residence listed in the country by approximately 400%. The essence of this case is the former president says things are valued as we say they are. And that's the only valuation that matters, what we say they are, not what they actually are, not what they're appraised at, not what their value is to bankers or insurers or others, and particularly tax collectors, where oftentimes the variance benefits the Trump Organization on both sides of the ledger, favorable loan rates, lower taxes. This is an example of that. Just
one of many examples. Robert Costa, I understand you just got a statement from one of Donald Trump's attorneys?
That's correct, Tarika. Alina Habba, who we have seen in the courtroom alongside former President Donald Trump throughout the civil fraud trial, has just issued a statement to CBS News and other organizations following this case. She said this verdict is, quote, manifest injustice. And she said, quote, given the grave stakes, we trust that the appellate division will overturn this egregious verdict and end this relentless persecution against my clients. And she says that if this stands as a ruling, quote, New York is no longer open for business. And this statement is indicative of what we're going to see in the coming months. We can't take the context out of this ruling away from what happened today. This happens in the middle of a presidential campaign. Just as former President Trump is about to secure the Republican nomination, should he do well in the South Carolina primary next week and on Super Tuesday in early March, and should he move toward that nomination, he is now going to be facing a criminal trial in New York on those hush money payments starting in late March, just as the general election begins, and having to be facing all of these appeals over this civil fraud ruling and having to potentially pay out hundreds of millions of dollars just months before the Republican National Convention and the election in November. And that's not to even go into what Scott McFarland and others have been covering so well, Trump's looming federal trial on January 6th, which is currently before the Supreme Court, at least in terms of how Trump's immunity or claimed immunity could delay that trial. He's also facing a federal trial on his use of classified material and his bringing of them back from the White House to Mar-a-Lago in Florida. All of this now circles Trump. But for Trump, having covered him for many years, it was, as Major and others have said, this civil fraud trial, more than all of the other cases that has consumed his interests, has brought him back to Lower Manhattan day after day for this trial because it has to deal with his money.
And I see Major Garrett over here shaking his head.
One of the things this will go to is the value of Donald Trump's word. And there is something in this document, page 36 again, that sheds some light on that. When challenged in a deposition about some particular tax valuation for Mar-a-Lago, he is asked, do you intend to do that? And the former president in the deposition says, when you say intend, intend doesn't mean we will do it. So a document that seems to suggest you have intention and are agreeing to that intention in perpetuity, as this particular tax document does, former President Trump says on the record, that doesn't mean we're going to do it. It means whatever we say it means, which goes to the heart of this underlying case and may, in that context, have political resonance beyond this afternoon.
Everything is so politically upside down. We are 18 days before Super Tuesday, and when we get the expected comment from Donald Trump himself about this judgment, it would be such a contrast to what President Biden was speaking about today, the death of Alexei Navalny, this outspoken critic of Vladimir Putin, this pressing international issue of the day. Donald Trump's statements from his organization and his attorney are about a civil judgment, with no indication this changes the political calculus for him or for the race at all.
All right, and I want to give Ricky Kleeman a chance to chime in. I know she was speaking or also wanted to chime in really quickly after Robert Costa was speaking about the election, obviously, and what the implications are there.
Well, I think that it's not only Robert Costa, but it's also Scott and Major. We've talked about this, and it is clear that the political and the legal collide at all times here. One of the things that they also brought up that I think is really important, it's one thing to say, for the judge to say that, and the AG to say, that this affects the marketplace, and that's why there should be such an extraordinary punishment. And I note again that there has never been such an extraordinary punishment when there have been no victims who have complained and when the money was paid back. So this case is singular. And so that will fall right into the rubric of the campaign. And it's exactly the words that Alina Habba has said. There are people in the real estate industry in New York that were very concerned about a judgment of any kind of magnitude. And this is extraordinary magnitude. And it has been said by people in the real estate industry that if it can happen to Donald Trump, it could happen to anyone if you want to wipe out an industry. So we can't negate the fact that there are other feelings out there in the community and the business community. This is not a simple win or loss. This is really complicated.
All right. Ricky Kleeman, Katrina Kaufman, Robert Costa, Scott McFarland, Major Garrett, thank you guys all for breaking that down for us. Once again, the headline this hour, a blockbuster ruling in the New York civil fraud trial against former President Donald Trump. A judge found Trump and the Trump Organization is liable for falsifying business records by overvaluing his assets and exaggerating his net worth in order to get better terms on loans. Trump is now ordered to pay more than $350 million in penalties and is barred from holding office at a New York company and getting loans from New York banks for 3 years. His children are barred for 2 of those years. Our coverage will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Jerika Duncan in Washington.
This is breaking news.
Good afternoon. I'm Dana Tyler. We continue to follow the breaking news here on CBS News New York. A state Supreme Court judge, Arthur Engoron, has ruled in the civil fraud case of former President Donald Trump, his 2 eldest sons, and 2 other former top executives at the Trump Organization. Judge Engoron's written decision came down just about 3 o'clock. The judge has ruled against Donald Trump, imposing a $354 million penalty against Trump himself. That total climbs to $364 million when you factor in fines for other members of the Trump Organization, including Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump, as well as Jeffrey McConnell and Alan Weiselberg of the Trump Organization. The sons barred from serving as officers or directors of any New York corporation for 3 years. Remember, this was a bench trial, no jury. Alice Gaynor has been covering the trial, has been in the courtroom watching everything from what is going on the bench, as well as what the former president has been doing in the seat, as well as what he's been saying outside. Alice.
And you mentioned, Dana, this was a bench trial, not a jury trial. That's because this kind of lawsuit does not allow for a jury trial. That's why the judge made this decision. It was posted publicly online. It's a 92-page ruling. The former president and his companies must pay, as Dana mentioned, more than $350 million. His two eldest sons must each pay over $4 million each, and former CFO Alan Weisselberg must pay $1 million. Trump, Weisselberg, and former controller Jeffrey McConney cannot serve as an officer or director of any New York corporation or legal entity in New York for 3 years. Eric and Donald Trump Jr., his two eldest sons, cannot serve as an officer or director for 2 years. Here's a wrap-up of what led to this decision. Before the bench trial began, Judge Arthur Engoron ruled that former President Donald Trump and top execs at the Trump Organization committed fraud for years, deceiving banks, insurers, and others by inflating his assets and net worth on statements of financial condition for 11 years in order to get better loan terms and other deals. To name a few, the size of Trump's penthouse at Trump Tower was exaggerated by nearly 3 times its size. Mar-a-Lago was valued as a single residence, but in 2002, Trump signed over any and all of their rights to develop the property for any usage other than club usage. Engoron then ordered some of Trump's business licenses rescinded, but an appeals court halted that order. An independent monitor agreed upon by both parties was ordered to oversee Trump Organization operations. That monitor wrote to the judge that after 14 months, I have identified certain deficiencies in the financial information that I have reviewed, including disclosures that are either incomplete, present results inconsistently, and/or contain errors. Trump attorneys shot back in a letter to the judge that the monitor, quote, points only to minor and immaterial discrepancies, and that further oversight is unwarranted and will only unjustly enrich the monitor as she engages in some Javert-like quest against the defendants, referencing the inspector in Victor Hugo's fictional Les Miserables. During the trial, the former president, his two eldest sons, Eric and Donald Trump Jr., and former Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg and former controller Jeffrey McConney all took the stand. They denied any wrongdoing, with Trump arguing his financial statements undervalued his assets and that they had disclaimers on them. Attorneys for the defendants argued there are no victims in this case, and none of the banks or others complained. New York's anti-fraud law requires the Attorney General show there were repeated fraudulent or illegal acts. New York Attorney General Letitia James had asked that Trump be banned from doing business in New York and pay $370 million, equal to what she said was saved interest and other ill-gotten gains. During closing arguments, attorneys explained more than $168 million was for saved interest on 4 commercial real estate loans, more than $139 million in profit for the sale of his old post office property, $60 million in profit for the sale of Ferry Point, and $2.5 million in bonuses paid to Weisselberg and McConney. So again, the AG was asking for $370. The judge awarded $364 in damages. The ruling also continues. The independent monitor also orders an independent director of compliance. The Attorney General will be holding a news conference this evening. Trump attorney Alina Habba released a statement a short time ago, and it says in part, given the grave stakes, we trust that the appellate division will overturn this egregious verdict and end this relentless persecution against my clients. Again, they will be appealing. We are awaiting comment from any of his other attorneys. There were quite a few representing McConney, Weisselberg, Trump's eldest sons as well. We're also waiting to see if he's going to post on Truth Social. And though they are going to be appealing this decision. So, Dana, I just want to point out, a lot of people were saying the defense points out there were no victims. No one complained in this case. But this anti-fraud law requires the Attorney General show there were repeated fraudulent or illegal acts. She did not have to show that anyone was in fact harmed. But the prosecution says the banks lost millions of dollars in interest. That's why they were asking for all of that money in damages. And they also argued that without the low interest rate savings that Trump, his sons, the company got, he would have been below the liquidity threshold for one of the banks. They were arguing cash had become an issue for him, actually, in 2016. They also say that misleading lenders distorts the market. In their closing argument, prosecutors had said that it prices out honest borrowers and can lead to more catastrophic results.
disgorgement, a word I hadn't heard of, ill-gotten gains.
Right.
Go back to H.E. James and this whole anti-fraud law. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Right. So again, she doesn't have to show that anybody was harmed exactly. Again, it just has to be that there were repeated fraudulent or illegal acts. And in a pretrial ruling, before the trial got underway, Judge Engoron ruled on that, saying there was fraud. And it went on for about 11 years in these statements of financial condition. The eldest sons, Eric, Donald Trump Jr., they took the stand. They said, well, we had nothing to do with preparing these statements of financial conditions. The other defendants said it was the accountants. Donald Bender with Mazars, which was the accounting firm the Trump organization used, he said, well, we never would have put out these SOFCs, as they're called, if we knew that they were false, because he testified on the stand that the Trump organization provided them with these numbers, and that's what they used. He also testified that he didn't receive all the appraisals for some of these assets, these properties.
Remember that.
But we also saw in court, there were emails where we saw former controller Jeffrey McConney asking Eric Trump, do you have a value on this? I want to include it in your father's statement of financial condition. They said repeatedly, we had nothing to do with these statements, but then we would see this evidence in court that there was some awareness that they knew they were contributing something.
Right.
And they also, Eric and Donald Trump Jr., they're in charge of the company, they would sign off on these documents to lenders signifying that everything was in order,
that they knew, they approved it. Having been in the courthouse, in the courtroom during this, and as you said, we've heard from Mr. Trump's attorney, Alina Habba, have not heard from Trump, but just talking about, this is as a looking back, not as how it did not affect the ruling. But one day he said, I have a deranged Trump-hating judge who railroaded his fake case through a New York state court at a speed never before seen. His behavior, which he said that out loud in the courthouse, went after the judge, attacked the clerk. There was a gag order, correct? I know you touched on a lot of this, but just as you look back personally in this experience as a professional, where does all that fit as well in how this justice has been meted?
Again, Judge Engoron in his pretrial ruling said they did commit fraud. He was determining 6 other factors like falsifying business records, insurance fraud, which he actually found they were not liable for. But he was determining 6 other things. However, it felt like Trump, his attorneys, they went into this already almost defeated, and of course they're on the defensive, they're defending themselves, but the tone in the courtroom was very combative. He took the stand and he was able to speak actually during closing arguments, which I've never seen a defendant do. He was allowed to speak and he said, I'm an innocent man, and then he went in on the Attorney General. And he also went in on the judge and said the judge had his own agenda, and the judge told, his attorneys, please control your client. We heard that a few times. Alina Habba made some remarks actually saying the Attorney General sitting back here with her shoes off and her Starbucks, and the judge was like, what does that have to do with anything? So it was just very combative in that courtroom, very tense, and I've never seen anything like it.
And let's also say again, he didn't have to be there.
Correct.
And he's been saying, I need to be on the campaign trail, especially after the decision yesterday on the Manhattan criminal court case starting March 25th, which he does need to be there. This all, as we know, into the political, we're not going to go there right now, we don't need to, but just the historic, that amount of money and so much talk about, does he have that liquid? Does he have that liquid assets, that cash at hand?
Right, that's the big question.
Plus the E. Jean Carroll, 83.5, plus the other 5.
That's right.
Right, in her defamation.
And of course, they're going to be appealing all these rulings. I just want to go back to what you were saying for a moment, just about campaigning and how he said this is taking away from his campaigning. Well, it felt almost like he was using this as an opportunity to campaign because, of course, all the cameras are there. So he spoke every chance he got in the courtroom hallway. Anytime we took a break, the lunch break, the quick little breaks throughout the day, he would speak to the cameras and he would talk about all kinds of things. Of course, he would go in on the AG and the judge and the case. And back to the gag order, he was fined, I believe it was 3 times, because he was posting about Judge Engoron's chief clerk, making comments about her. And he took that very seriously because they were receiving, he said, all kinds of death threats, emails, calls. At one point there was an incident where the court was delayed in the morning because there was a possible security, concern at his home, at the judge's home. So, Mr. Trump ended up being fined quite a few times for breaking this gag order because he kept making comments. about the court staff. Yes.
Yeah, as he does. Let's go to Letitia James, the Attorney General who brought this case for the state. And as you mentioned, she is going to have a news conference. It's unclear if there will be questions asked of her. She had asked for $370 million. Her presence, let's talk about her in the courtroom, what you think this means for her.
That's right. You know, she would sit there, first row in the gallery, over to the right, and every day, all of the defendants, when they were there, the attorneys would walk past her. I believe it was the first day Trump was there, Mr. Trump, he walked past her and sort of glared at her, I caught. But other than that, they didn't seem to look at each other. And she was there quietly. Her team was up presenting the case, the prosecutors. But she was certainly in that courtroom watching, paying attention, and several times she was referenced by either an attorney or one of the defendants attacking her, but she just sat there professionally and was listening.
And she has maintained that no one is immune from justice. No one can, not from justice, no one is immune, no one is immune, period.
Correct.
Of wrongdoing, you know.
And of course, one of the big days
being
in
prosecuted.
Court, Dana, was Michael Cohen was there.
Yes, who brought this
I mean,
to
he's
Congress.
the whole reason this all came about, this investigation.
Sure.
He testified to Congress back in 2019 that this was all going on, that Trump and employees of the Trump organization were lying about his wealth. That's what led to this AG investigation. He took the stand, and of course, that was very tense. No one knew what that was going to be like. He's Trump's former lawyer and fixer, and the defense pounced on this, you know, saying he's a known liar. He makes money off Trump's name with his, you know, podcasts and his books. And he testified, he said that it was his job, along with former CFO Alan Weisselberg, they would inflate the numbers. But he said Trump never explicitly said, hey, go inflate the assets. He said, quote, he speaks like a mob boss. He would say, I'm not worth $6 billion, I'm worth $7, I'm worth $8. And they knew, he testified, what he meant. So then they would go, and I think he said they would reverse engineer the various different asset classes, increase those assets to reach the number. That's what Michael Cohen had said on the stand.
Alleging sort of Trump speak, that was understood, and all of the inflations of square footage and, as we said, dollar value. Alice, I know you have to get to work on the stories on this really historic day. A former
92
president.
pages. We're going to go read through it all.
Yes, we have it right here, highlighting it so that we understand, and it's available to anyone online. That's
Publicly
important
posted,
to say.
yes.
Publicly,
All of the documents are online.
What website? Where do they go for that?
If you go to, I believe it's the courts. We have this all posted on CBSNewYork.com.
Yeah, my bad.
Of course. I have to keep track. We've been in several different courthouses lately, but it is all online if you would like to read it at home yourself and see exactly what was said.
All right, we'll see you on the air.
I will see you then.
At 5 and 6. Thank you, Alice. Okay. We're going to continue here, streaming on CBS News New York. A lot at stake with Judge Engoron's decision. Joining us now to sort this all out is Bennett Gershman, former New York prosecutor and law professor at Pace University. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Reaction. Let's just go off the top. The reaction on this $364 million decision, this penalty.
My reaction, Donald Trump doesn't like to lose, and this is a huge loss for Donald Trump. My reaction also is to explain the magnitude of this case, because some people have said that Judge Engoron's decision was an overreach, it was too harsh. I mean, as I see this case, Donald Trump's fraud over a period of at least a decade, that was $3.6 billion a year. He overstated his net worth. Oh, $3.6 billion. I don't know that there's ever been business fraud or a business corruption case in New York reaching that magnitude. And so, you know, this is business corruption at the highest degree, it seems to me. You know, I heard people saying, well, there was no victim and nobody complained. But, you know, when you're dealing with corruption, and I prosecuted corruption for a long time, everybody is happy with the transaction, whether it's bribery. So that's not a really good argument, I don't think. In addition, Judge Engoron, who is you know, this is an equity decision. Judge Engoron has broad discretion here. in terms of how he's going to mete out the punishment.
We've heard. Pardon. Go right ahead.
I mean, he has huge discretion, and I think the appellate courts, when they take an appeal here, are going to recognize that broad discretion that the judge has in deciding what kind of punishment is appropriate, disgorgement of ill-gotten gains, and there were huge, huge ill-gotten gains here, unjust enrichment, things like that is what the judge is supposed to do. And he has this incredibly, extraordinarily broad discretion to decide on the appropriate remedy here. So this is not something that, we can say is a minor case where the judge is imposing a harsh penalty. This is a massive fraud where the judge is imposing a penalty that the judge believes is commensurate with the misconduct, with the corruption.
Let's talk about, you brought up the appellate. What avenue, how does the Trump team, they've said they are going to appeal, how does that work? What can they afford to do? What are the risks?
There are no risks to taking an appeal. It's just that they're going to have to, first of all, they're going to have to put up some kind of they're going to have to pay this penalty somehow. And this is a huge penalty that might be too much for Trump to even pay. It's $364 or $5 million. Look, they'll claim that Judge Engoron overreached, that he abused his discretion, that this is the harshest penalty that's ever been meted out to a businessman in New York City, on and on and on. But, the appellate court will review this as they typically review a case and see whether there was any abuse of discretion, whether there were legal errors that were committed. And so we'll see.
Before we go here, Mr. Gershman, can we talk about, as a New Yorker, just as his business empire, his image, how do you see this affecting that?
Well, his business empire now is going to be closed down for at least 3 years. We have a receiver who's going to supervise the businesses. And I'm sure that Mr. Trump doesn't appreciate the fact that he's being left out. He's now just an outsider, a distant onlooker. And, the businesses will continue under the supervision of Barbara Jones. And we'll just see how that develops. But certainly he's not going to have any role in it. His sons are not going to have any role in the businesses. And that's one of the, look, it could have been a lot worse.
That's right.
Judge Engoron dissolved all of his businesses. He didn't do that. The fine could have been a lot worse. He didn't do that. He could have made this receivership for indefinite, 5 years, 10 years. He didn't do that. So in other words, he was fairly, controlled and somewhat less, aggravating in terms of the instances. And that's going to be something that the appellate court is going to note.
What, before we go, political campaign impact? As he is the Republican front runner, everybody has an opinion. What's yours?
Trump campaigns in the courtroom, so this is something that he's now going to use, and it seems that every time he gets in trouble, his supporters love it. So that's the way it's going to end up.
We thank you for joining us, Mr. Gershman. Thank you so much for your perspective as a former prosecutor and a Pace University professor. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Dana.
You're welcome. To recap, a $364 million penalty has been imposed against former President Donald Trump and the Trump Organization. New York Judge Arthur Engoron issued the decision about 3 o'clock this afternoon when we received it. This is after a 2.5-month trial. The penalty is part of a lawsuit filed by New York Attorney General Letitia James, who sued Trump on claims he duped banks with financial statements that had inflated his wealth. We'll have much more on the case coming up at CBS 2 News at 5. I'll see you at 6 and continuing here streaming on CBS News New York. See you then.
This has been breaking news.
A quick check at your first alert forecast, where we've issued a yellow alert for a storm system arriving tonight that could mean some snow showers, disruptions, especially if you're out early on Saturday. So late tonight, early tomorrow, light to moderate snowfall. So we're thinking a little bit more than what we saw last night, although this is not a repeat of Tuesday. And the main impact is going to be travel. We think it's going to be cold enough to stick, so some impacts there. And that's why the National Weather Service has issued that winter weather advisory. Basically, areas areas shaded in purple. The further south you go into Jersey, say your travel's taking to Pennsylvania down, that's where you'll see the bigger accumulations, but certainly notable accumulations. The city is out of it for the most part, except for Staten Island. In terms of our forecast for snow totals, 1 to 3 is what we've got.